Okay, so hi, I'm Jordan Eizenga. Going to talk about how I was studying informal labor in Delhi. So, just some brief background on my project. I was working with an academic institute called the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. It's a major social scientific research center, not aligned with any or not associated with any university. It's located in Delhi. I was there for about 2 months, which I spent designing and carrying out a research project. I'm currently writing like 2 papers based on the results. Now the school year started, I'm very slowly writing 2 papers. But I'm going to try to talk about both, but I'll probably only have time to talk about the first one. So we'll see how that goes. So by way of background, we should introduce like what I mean when I say the informal sector. So this is a very commonly used definition in the academic literature. So it's basically the section of the economy that's legal, but not formally regulated by the state. And then the informal labor are kind of the parallel definition for labor, where it's basically a function of the terms of the contract of labor. So I actually have some issues with this definition, which I might get to and I might not. But that's roughly what I'm talking about. So in India, this is really especially relevant because the labor force is almost entirely informal. 93% of the labor force in India has no legal status. Okay, so this is one of the most distinctive features of the Indian labor force as opposed to other labor forces around the world, even in the developing world. And it's also this is like a very significant fact for a lot of things that we care about, like economic growth and labor exploitation. So it's an important thing to study. So broadly then, what I was concerned with is how informal labor is represented in the political system and how it is incorporated into the Indian democracy. So those are kind of my broad research interests. And then specifically to answer that, I did a case study on the political incorporation of the cycle rickshaw workers in Delhi. So some of the benefits of this specific project is that the cycle rickshaw sector is a very numerically important sector. In Delhi alone, you see over 500,000 people pulling cycle rickshaws. And across India, it's millions. So Delhi is also a good place to study because in terms of municipal politics and municipal law, it's it's very influential. You'll see a lot of Delhi laws replicated in other parts of the country for reasons I don't really understand. And there's also, as I'll hopefully get to, there's some analytical clarity in terms of the political interests of the cycle rickshaw sector. And also, it's a convenient place to study it because of the location. It's an English-friendly place. So those are roughly, I'm just going to skip this. Okay, so some context. The cycle rickshaw sector is, as I mentioned, it's really large. And it's common in most Indian metropolises, except for some that have very hilly territory because cycle rickshaws can't pull on hills. It's organized into fleets. So an owner will own anywhere between like 5 and 500 cycle rickshaws, and then they'll rent them out to the cycle rickshaw pullers on a daily basis for somewhere around maybe 20 rupees a day. So it's very cheap, but it's important because there's not necessarily employers in the cycle rickshaw. So you have to question what you think of or what you mean when you say that we're talking about laborers and labor relations. In Delhi, there's a whole host of very onerous regulations and restrictions, which I could spend a long time talking about, and hopefully I won't. So just some briefly, owners are required to be the pullers. Okay, if you are not the owner of the rickshaw, you can't pull it legally. There's also you can't own more than one cycle rickshaw legally. Each cycle rickshaw is restricted to operating within a certain region of the city, and you also has a very complicated registration system where you have to register in multiple locations. You have to register to pull. You have to register to own, and for each of these, there are quantitative caps on the number you can register in the city. So roughly 90,000 that can be registered. If you are guilty of breaking any of these laws, your cycle rickshaw is liable to be impounded and then crushed. You can just destroy the rickshaw. So as you hopefully picked up, the industry is completely illegal. There are roughly 5 times as many cycle rickshaws as are allowed. Cycle rickshaws don't stay in one area of the city, at least not intentional or not by design. They're organized into fleets. People own more than one. People are not owners when they're pulling. And so the way that this continues to function is basically through corruption. I mean, there are bribes pretty much everywhere along the way. So you bribe to get, for any of the registration, you have to bribe multiple people to get it registered. You have to bribe to operate without a registration, and you even sometimes have to bribe to operate with registration. Pretty much any step along the way you can get bribed, either to police or to low-level administrative officials in the Municipal Corporation of Delhi. So you have this kind of strange paradox where also these corruptions and the harsh penalties regarding like impoundment and destruction, they choke out legal businesses because they create a very high-risk environment that eliminates the possibility for independent owner-operators, which are the only legal forms of the business can take, to function and to stay afloat. And it also has this, with the industry, it creates interest groups because these large fleet owners, despite the fact that their businesses are illegal, the fact that it chokes out small businesses means that they don't have any competition. So they actually favor the policy regime despite the fact that it's formally oppressive to them. So in this context, there's been some advocacy work, and the policy regime was actually overturned almost entirely in early February. So I'm going to be focusing largely on the period before that. So in some sense, this is kind of a history project. So I think I'm running a little short. So when you're talking about labor politics, of course, you have to talk about trade unions. And this is kind of a brief history. The punchline is that unions were at one point a very significant political force in India in the early days of independence. Since then, they have had a kind of a very bizarre relationship with political parties, and now they're very fragmented and weak, and they're general consensus, which scholars do challenge, but the general consensus is that they don't have a lot of force. They can't make changes very easily. So, and I should mention, one of the reasons that they've lost a lot of their force is because the labor force has become so highly informal. Okay, it's been a strategy by capital actors to subvert labor regulation and labor unionization. So the informal sector is kind of this point of strategic weakness among the trade union movement. But then I'd like to point out that it's also an incredibly large portion of the population. So this is not necessarily a point of strategic weakness on every dimension, but it's something that historically has been a problem for the trade union movement. So I would expect that trade unions are trying to strategize with respect to this weakness, but there's really not a lot of research saying what trade unions are doing or what trade unions are doing about the informal sector, or how informal sector is organizing on its own. So I started doing interviews with the organizational level officials in trade unions and trade union congresses. And I also, in the course of this, found some quantitative data that has significant relevance, which I haven't analyzed yet, and I'm actually still getting some of the permissions from the people who collected it to use. But so I'm not going to be presenting that, but in the future, hopefully that'll work its way into my papers. And some things that I'm going to briefly go over, like my findings. I found that it's very, very highly fragmented. In firms, you'll often find in India that there would be multiple trade unions operating within a single factory. So it leads to a lot of fragmentation and competition. Now, there's no firms in the cycle rickshaw sector, but it's even divided by neighborhoods. You'll have multiple trade unions operating in one neighborhood, or they'll be operating in one neighborhood and then the next slum over, there won't be any. They're also allied with political parties, even at the very lowest level, and there's a lot of infighting between them. And they organize into these congresses, and the congresses also won't cooperate with each other. And there's, in terms of the informal sector broadly, and also the cycle rickshaw sector in particular, the trade union congresses have been strategically, I'm going to characterize it as strategically withdrawing from the informal sector. So all of the organizational level officials acknowledge that there are unique difficulties operating in the informal sector. Most significant is that there's literally no job security because there's no regulations. So you can be fired on a moment's notice and there's no legal recourse. And despite that, or despite the fact, so I should say, that's but to contextualize where these things are coming from. But the major union congresses in India are not concerned with the informal sector. Even they don't have a single person in any of their staffs devoted to any informal sector in particular, or the informal sector as a whole. Okay, whereas it's common to see like high-level officials will be the president of just one union, in addition to being organizational level officials. They're like unaware of like even like, recent developments. People who were supposedly had been involved in the cycle rickshaw sector did not know that the policy regime had been overturned. Like they're clueless about like most of the daily goings on, and some of them would even tell me that they didn't look into it. They waited for cycle rickshaw people to come to them. So when they do operate in the informal sector, they generally operate by removing all the activities that are difficult to do in the informal sector. So they don't attempt to incorporate any sort of militant action. They'll, and most of the times they write letters of complaint about how their employers aren't meeting minimum wage to labor offices, which then do nothing. So when I asked them what they're doing to address these problems in informal labor, what they usually told me is that they were working to, in different words, they were to pass protectionist trade policies so that they couldn't informalize the places where they already had unions. So they're very conservative and defensive policy, I guess. So we're not looking at this 93% of the informal or the labor force that is informal, and instead they're trying to consolidate their hold over this very slim section of that's highly privileged and protected. Sorry. And then when I did find cycle rickshaw unions, which there were several of, they weren't even unions of cycle rickshaw pullers. They were usually fleet owners. So these were formally trade unions, but they were more closely resembled trade groups in a lot of senses. So I'm already over. Okay, so anyway, trade unions had more or less withdrawn and were not representing the informal sector workers. So what I did is I went to, I knowing that there had been this, the political activity, I started looking at some NGOs that had been involved, which were the officials in the government said were more significant. And what I found there is that even among the NGOs, there were really a lot of problems in terms of representation. Most of them, because they were not labor organizations, were not representing labor. For instance, there were environmentalist groups that were involved in the cycle rickshaw sector because it was a non-polluting mode of transport, but they didn't address labor issues in most cases. And they were also allying with trade groups that were consciously not devoted to the skip this. Okay, they're consciously like not devoted to worker issues, and they and probably most significant is that they had no involvement for cycle rickshaw pullers. There's no direct involvement. So in a lot of respects, these appear to be a lot closer to maybe strategic allies or people who are operating kind of the strategic space that's kind of been left by the withdrawal of the trade unions, where they're taking advantage of the kind of the political usefulness of such a large sector, but there are really not a lot of people who are representing the cycle rickshaw workers or the informal sector in general in the Indian political system. So I didn't get to everything, but hopefully that gives you some idea. All right, thank you.